So our next session is Reimagining Society Through Extremist Narratives. So without further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Vivian Gerrand from Deakin University for her presentation, Needs, Narratives, Networks, Understanding Militant Wellness.
Thanks a lot, Imogen. So my paper today will focus on wellness communities and COVID-19 conspiracies. Can everyone hear me? Or should I use, yep. And understanding grievances particularly. It will problematise pipelines, reclaiming the need to reclaim the complexity of radicalisation trajectories. It will look at trusted sources in troubled times, thinking about the ways in which conspiracy theories and influences operating in a low trust environment have compelling narratives in such times, distrust. And it will finish by emphasising what we might be able to learn from some of the grievances experienced during COVID-19, looking particularly at the case study of communities within Victoria, particularly in Melbourne. My paper will touch briefly, obviously, on the online dimensions of mis, dis and malinformation that have contributed to the rise of militant wellness movements, but it will give most of its attention to grievances and the grievances driving them, because while emerging literature has begun to analyse the online narratives and networks of conspiritual and alt health influences, a recent literature review undertaken with colleagues internationally identifies a need to understand emerging grievances and vulnerabilities and their interplay with extremist messaging and platforms through qualitative research to better grasp them and how these increase vulnerability to the spread of disinformation. As I said, thinking in terms of radicalisation, we understand it, or the literature understands it as being a complex intersection of a conducive environment of push factors and pull factors that can happen through online messaging, etc. So the idea that someone might see a TikTok video and become radicalised is one that all the literature suggests is very unlikely to happen, and that there has to be an underlying grievance for someone to go on a radical trajectory most of the time. So I think it's important to remember this, especially when we're thinking in terms of the rise of online disinformation, etc., because as we know, it's very difficult to regulate big tech platforms. Attempts are ongoing, fantastic studies are being done, but with the rise of things like artificial intelligence, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep up with the fast-moving nature of these kinds of technologies and their ability to present us with alternative narratives and facts that contest the possibility of a shared reality. So thinking in terms of grievances actually gives us in this space, I think, significant agency in the kinds of interventions we might be able to develop at a policy level, hence my emphasis on grievances here. Spiritual and wellness communities, long-time proponents of complementary and alternative healing practices, were not immune to conspiracy thinking well before the arrival of COVID-19. The introduction of conspiracies such as the divisive QAnon ideology into these communities through prominent lifestyle influences led some to radicalise along conspiritual trajectories of militancy, including recruitment into violent extremism. COVID-19 intensified engagement with this movement, which attracted new adherents through the promotion of the idea that the pandemic was an opportunity for awakening, planetary ascension, and transformation, in pointed contrast to government public health and biomedical strategies adopted to address the crisis that were represented as a threat to freedom, mental and physical well-being. Messaging within conspiritual networks encouraged alternative health and spiritual practices, such as intuition, magic, bodily autonomy, as a mode of resistance to public health measures such as mask wearing, lockdowns and vaccines, which were viewed as instruments of deep state control and surveillance, together with 5G technologies. This messaging intersected with the accelerationist narratives of far-right political actors, which also promoted anti-vaccine sentiment through the notion, for example, that the COVID-19 vaccine rollout was part of a plot to sterilise white populations. Built around a shared propensity to conspiracism, distrust in institutions and government, pseudoscience, rejection of the biomedical model, and Darwinian notions of survival of the fittest, these novel formations represent an increasingly urgent yet understudied phenomenon within scholarship on extremist movements. Adherence to conspiracy and extreme wellness movements are readily dismissed as unstable, yet the motivations driving their trajectories of radicalisation are both highly complex and context dependent, requiring detailed and critically empathetic analysis of the narratives, networks, and nuances that inform their pathways into militant radicalisation. Public health measures critical to stopping the global spread of COVID-19 led to job loss, uncertainty, trauma, and increased time spent online. In addition to ushering in an era of expanded internet dominance, the impacts of the pandemic in countries like Australia, the US, Canada, and Europe, and elsewhere deepened existing socioeconomic atomisation and inequalities, and with them vulnerabilities to alternative explanations and kinds of social influence that we can see here in this environment of distrust and a heightened sense of grievance and fear. Perceptions that public health measures were authoritarian were accompanied by a parallel growth in conspiracy-oriented ideologies, which, through the virtue of attempting to remove the misinformation, also reified some figures to the status of truth tellers in alternative realms where they would be uncancelled and free to spread their messaging on platforms like alt-tech platforms such as Gab, Rumble, etc. These infiltrated and connected unexpected demographics, including stay-at-home mothers, Indigenous communities, extreme right actors, and yoga practitioners. Uniting them was a search for alternative explanations that might help make sense of what was happening, especially in situations of lockdown for those who were effectively housebound because of mobility and travel restrictions and unable to undertake their normal activities. These dynamics fostered increased crossover between the far right and a radical action orientation that is now discernible in some wellness and spiritual epistemic communities. A small minority of conspiritualists have radicalised to what I term, along with Beres-Remsky and Walker, militant wellness. Militancy is conjoined here with wellness to refer to the ways in which some cohorts within these demographics now position themselves as being in a state of combat or conflict, usually with public health measures imposed by governments. I'm just going to show a short video just to demonstrate just how this hasn't been limited to the peak pandemic years, but is an ongoing problem for a minority of people within these cohorts.
Which means it's time to start raising chickens.
This is Awaken with JP, who's now a freedom fighter thanks to his radicalisation during the pandemic, and he's still making videos. This is one of his most recent ones on how to survive upcoming lockdowns. So he's promoting the idea that because of the new COVID variants, we're going to be having further lockdowns. So this is how he suggests we manage that situation.
Issues into your own hands, which means it's time to start raising chickens for eggs and stop paying your taxes. With their daily egg production, you can sustain your family very well. You just got to keep the chickens alive, which means you'll probably want to get a guard dog. Your guard dog will ward off predators, keep your chickens safe, and serve as a good source of meat should your chickens ever stop laying eggs. In times of desperation, having your own food supply also involves growing vegetables. They are a great way to nutritionally sustain yourself if you're a giraffe or a zebra. And if you're a human, vegetables are also very helpful at helping you sustain your life because they're an excellent place to hide a firearm under. Your vegetable garden gives you strategic hiding spots for your firearms, which will help you protect your actual food supply. Haha, I like vegetables.
So while the specific influencers, including JPCs, haven't engaged in overt violent actions consistent with those of terrorists, they have adopted, we see, militant stances that draw on a repertoire of extremist bonding icons, whether it was Pete Evans in November 2020 posting the black sun symbol with the MAGA cap on his Instagram page, or JPCs mobilising around firearms, cosplaying far-right kind of messaging, or Christian Northrup, Dr. Christian Northrup, who's probably more of an adherent to what has been termed pastel QAnon by Argentino and others, thinking in terms of the ways in which women's attempt to reclaim their bodily autonomy and sovereignty has also led to a kind of invocation of militant defence of one's ability to resist something like a vaccine mandate, for example. Extremist groups with divergent ideologies have undergone accelerated cross-pollination during the COVID-19 crisis, and scholars like Argentino have begun to pay attention towards developing syncretic trends and common philosophical emphases amongst extremist groups, such as an investment in purity and black and white thinking and sovereignty. In this sense, the pandemic enabled mostly far-right extremist actors to mobilise and recruit within diverse demographics. And we've seen also some of the the violent action that has come out of this, including in Australia, with people being attacked during the 2021 long lockdown in Melbourne, but also in Germany, a worker being killed after asking someone to wear a mask. And then in December, as we know, 2022, with the Willem-Villa attack on police. And while those attackers were not necessarily identified with as being practitioners of wellness, they certainly had resisted vaccine mandates. So there's some interesting and disturbing intersections there that are really important to note. And when I saw that video with JP Sears, it made me think about the Willem-Villa attack and the way in which those attackers had actually isolated themselves and were in that survivalist mentality of trying to live off the grid, etc. And I wanted to also draw attention to these 3 recent books. I'm reading Naomi Klein's Doppelganger at the moment, but the ways in which they emphasize just how these kinds of conspiracies, each one of them locates it in a profound sense of powerlessness. And I think it's a really important set of interventions that we can use as well to think in terms of how to respond and how to develop proactive, long-term kind of interventions to prevent more people going down these roads. And the author of this particular review of these 3 books talks about how each of the authors identifies this powerlessness, which has been exploited by actual elites, as opposed to the conspiratorial, blood-drinking reptilian ones. And he also talks about how the retreat into our digital selves, the lack of agency is both entrenched and rendered a source of resentment by our isolation, our loss of faith in collective effort, and indeed in a consensual understanding of reality. As in other democracies that imposed vaccine mandates, demonstrations in Australia during the longest of its 6 lockdowns during 2020 and 2021 have included anti-democratic extremists seeking to capitalise on pandemic-induced grievances, including credible threats against government and public health officials' lives. A range of other countries saw healthcare workers, vaccination centres and ordinary citizens complying with public health orders also become targets of hate. Alt-right groups have converged with anti-mask, anti-vaccine and anti-lockdown protesters at medical facilities, with healthcare workers also experiencing physical assault. Such incidents highlight the deleterious social consequences of the turn toward militancy. And while the targeted violence displayed in their behaviour is specific, in this case, to the context of the pandemic, it's not unique in its impulse to attack, define and remove an enemy, an impulse shared by all exclusivist violent groups and one that threatens democracy. That the activists themselves claim to be dissenting in defence of their freedoms is critical. Within the Australian context, in which the emergency measures were used to pursue a COVID-0 strategy for much of 2020 and 2021, this conducive environment of grievances arguably peaked during Melbourne's 6th lockdown. Unlike the rest of Australia, Melbourne had a uniquely long lockdown in 2020 that lasted from July until October of that year. Many of us here probably lived through it. While this lockdown proved damaging to mental health and livelihoods, and in some cases breached human rights, when we think about the lockdown of the towers, for example, it nevertheless provided the outcome of 0 COVID cases, freeing the city to reopen once the lockdown ended. During the 6th lockdown in 2021, on the other hand, many in the community were already at breaking point, both financially and psychologically. Without the economic support experienced for closed businesses through the Australian federal government's JobKeeper and JobSeeker schemes that have protected livelihoods and people from poverty in 2020. When vaccine mandates were introduced in the middle of this 3rd long lockdown, the conducive environment of grievances peaked. The absence of supports and increased strain on the community increased the vulnerability of some to the influence of conspiratorial and far-right influencers who appeared to be listening sympathetically to community concerns about the impact of long lockdowns and fears about new generation vaccines being mandated. Represented in the media, we saw the demonstrations as neo-Nazi demonstrations often, the civil street protests that ensured served as recruitment grounds for disgruntled members of the community, putting them in touch, many for the first time, with far-right agendas and organisations. Prominent lifestyle influencers switched from left-wing to right-wing seemingly overnight in ways that have confounded easy analyses of their ideological dispositions. In an attempt to address this phenomenon, I've been undertaking as part of the Crisis Points project a series of interviews with allied and alternative health practitioners in Victoria to understand what we might be able to learn from these experiences. The questions asked include things like what people's perspectives were on the COVID-19 pandemic, what their perspectives were on the government pandemic response, whether they have secure housing, questions relating to information environments, messaging that may have been encountered, the impact of particular kinds of emergency restrictions, and whether the interviewee thought that the protocols could have been implemented differently, and if so, how, and their feelings about government. So the Melbourne-based participants that I've interviewed so far include a female allied health worker, an alternative health worker, a male mental health worker, and another female allied health worker. And these interviews are in-depth and qualitative. They began in June this year and they're ongoing. The average duration of the interviews is 1.5 hours. And I'm using an open coding process to understand the data as it emerges. So reflecting on the COVID-19 experience, the first question that was asked was the perspective on the COVID-19 pandemic. And not surprisingly, the view was that this was an exercise in control. So there was an uncertainty about whether this was actually planned or not. I should also say that each of the people that I've interviewed are not engaged in any way in any kind of anti-government activity. They have not expressed any kind of desire to inflict harms on others, but they are adjacent to a lot of conspiracy-based thinking about the pandemic, and so they're a useful entry point to understand some of the key grievances within these communities. I would not define any of these people as extremists, but I think their perspectives are incredibly valuable for understanding some of the kinds of anti-government extremism we've seen on the rise. So one of the participants, some of the participants shared views such as that they thought the scientific approach to the pandemic was lacking. They didn't believe the government was transparent in its approach. There was a lot of bitterness and anger, even though people had adhered. So each of the participants did adhere to the protocols. They did each comply with the vaccine mandates, for example. But I feel now that things could have been done differently. There was a lack of leadership. And it was generally a consensus within the different participants that things were handled better at the beginning than they were as time wore on. There was a view that this was like a power grab, a way of seizing control, particularly at the level of Victoria, not so much Australia-wide. The idea that Victoria was an anomaly, it was out of control, all the kind of messaging around Dictator Dan was something that a couple of the participants had definitely taken on in their views. There was a lot of comparison between, for example, the New South Wales health response and the Victorian health response. One of the interesting points and not surprising ones was this breakdown in trust. So the sense in which one of the participants used to trust media sources such as the ABC, the BBC, but this trust had been broken down, and particularly with COVID, the trust dropped like a grenade to finish off the rest of it. There was an attempt to turn to different and alternative sources of information like Voice for Victoria. So, and then this interesting reflection on the part of the male mental health worker who is clearly generally someone that would adhere to progressive left-wing media, but found himself listening to conservative commentators because those people seem to be making more sense. And now this person doesn't know who they trust and thinks that's a hangover from this whole situation. But at the same time, this person will still turn on the ABC to establish basic facts about situations. Some interesting reflections. Okay, I'm out of time, but this is, anyway, I look forward to some discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivian. Sorry to cut your time a bit short, but we'll have time for a couple of questions. So now we're going to hear from two more people from Deakin, Dr. Helen Young and Associate Professor Geoff Boucher. And their presentation is looking at understanding extremism through political fictions.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk and Jeff's going to help out when we get to question time. So from the neo-Nazism of William L. Pierce, Colin Jordan and Harold A. Covington to the accelerationism of James Mason and identitarianism of the French New Right, books are a significant method for dissemination of far-right ideas and positions. This includes fictions, the Turner Diaries, Covington's Northwest Quintet, and Jean Raspail's Camp of the Saints, for example, are all recognised as having contributed to incitement to extremist violence. So the majority of research into such books has focused on tracking and attempting to account for their influence, including specifically linking them to specific acts of violence. Very little of it has come from literary studies perspectives, and we're working on that. So in this paper, however, we consider fiction as a particular subset of political communication. We suggest that books like these are a fruitful space to explore practical and conceptual questions around the question of what differentiates dissent from extremism. We're sort of covering only part of this today in the interest of time. So fictions construct seemingly truthful but nonetheless highly ideological social scenarios that can project violent political, ideological, religious programs. Under the guise of being just fiction, literature can represent violence, vilification, and advocacy for extremist positions. And it circulates with very, very few exceptions quite freely in mainstream commercial contexts. In this paper, we argue through a case study that I'll get to in a bit, that exploring such fictions offers us ways to understand the blurred line between dissent and extremism that characterises, as we're obviously focused on, the contemporary CVE landscape. So the imaginative scenarios that we find in fiction enables detailed analysis of ideological positions, political programs, and crucially for our argument, communication. So we draw on both speech act theory and literary theory in our exploration. So we begin from the position that hate speech is rightly criminalised as vilification because of the pragmatic quality of the speech act. This has to do with what is known in speech act theory as the illocutionary force component of the utterance of what is said or written. That can be thought of in the present context as a practical imperative to turn aversive prejudice into discriminatory action. So extremism, from the perspective of language use, is a set of statements inciting violence or arguably advocating discrimination, which may then lead to violence. So we're interested today in fictions that specifically do the former, incite violence, in line with current Australian government definitions of violent extremism. We do note in saying this that discrimination against marginalised groups can itself either be or become a force of violence when it either results directly in physical harm, such as through lack of resources, or is framed in aversive ways that dehumanise groups and position them as enemies of an in-group or majority. And we're thinking here, or this obviously resonates with what Jan Berger was saying this morning. So as we said, literary texts very seldom criminalised in Western democracies, certainly in the modern era. The Turner Diaries, the most notorious and clearly linked to terroristic violence, is restricted for sale in Australia to people who are over 18, but completely legal to own and sell. We're not arguing that this should change, but rather making the point to illustrate the way that fictions are conceptualised as a different class of communication in order to get at why they are positioned in this way. This has to do with the pragmatics of speech, specifically the way that fictional representations suspend the illocutionary force of the speech act. That is to say, although the characters in a novel or a novella behave as if a spoken imperative should lead to violence, so they do the things in the fiction text, the reader is released from the performative dimension of the speech act. So they are understood and understand themselves, except in very specific circumstances, as not being told to imitate the violent actions of the character. So this sort of sacred ring that we have around fictional narrative provides dissident authors with certain other protections that are often used under conditions of persecution, but also can be exploited in other circumstances. So we think three are relevant here. The first can be called the equivocation of reference. So even when a fictional narrative is highly realistic, the fictional story itself refers to an imaginary universe that only resembles the real world. That is, fiction is a kind of make-believe, and everybody knows it. The second is what we can term semantic ambiguity. So narrative techniques in the fiction writing employ rhetorical devices and figurative tropes to present possible experiences as aestheticized sequences of action whose meaning depends on interpretation. And it's the interpretation is the key point here, and I'll come back to that. The third factor is the incompleteness of the stratum of presented objects. So the text presents an outline of events and reality that is radically incomplete compared with reality itself. The role of the reader is the active completion of the represented scene as an imagined world. When reading, to put it simply, we fill in the blanks, crucially in line with our own ideologies and perceptions of the world and how it works. So these three typical characteristics of narrative fiction shroud the commitments of the text in uncertainty and make it very difficult to say more than that a particular book, interpreted from a specific perspective, has certain ideological implications. These features, of course, can be maximised by writers, something that has shielded dissident authors from Shakespeare to Solzhenitsyn. But what about the cases when these features are deliberately suppressed? So, as I've said, there are some well-known cases of literary fiction where the role of the narrative in the incitement of violence is uncontested. So both the Turner Diaries and the Northwest Quintet incite politically and ideologically motivated violence. This is very well recognised. There's widespread agreement that these texts provide an imaginative context for anti-government terrorism and mass casualty attacks, and have played a role in both planning and execution of those things. Their authors, moreover, were both prominent neo-Nazis who advocated violence, including race war, in other statements and non-fiction writings. So the books fall within the scope of the concept of extremism, not of dissent. To our knowledge, however, it's not yet been noticed that a likely reason for this is because of the literary uncertainty, the things I was talking about before, is systematically switched off by their narrative techniques. So they're written in ways that speak to particular readers very clearly and actively. Okay, so in her examination of propaganda texts, Sarah Suleiman defines authoritarian fictions through a set of narrative techniques. The precise definition is beyond the scope of this paper, but these provide for, one, a monological interpretation based on, two, highly restricted semantic ambiguity, while referring the reader at the completion of the work to an extra textual doctrine centred in a practical imperative. That is, they have a single controlling voice that narrativizes the author's ideology and can be interpreted in only one way, and point the reader to a specific political doctrine that calls on them to then act in a particular way. In the cases of the Turner Diaries, pointing to neo-Nazism, and Pearce's National Alliance organisation, for example. So one of us has shown elsewhere that the Turner Diaries in fact meets these criteria, which given its record is an unsurprising result, but which corroborates this approach. We have, together with Rachel Featherston, shown that there's a very significant body of recent fiction depicting a second civil war in the USA that also meets these criteria. It looks like the extremism/dissent distinction in the literary field revolves upon the strategic but not complete suppression of the aesthetic qualities of literature, the undermining of the conceptualization of fiction as not reality, and the substitution of an extra-textual doctrine for the illocutionary force component of the speech act. So these things make some texts into vilificatory speech acts, despite their literary form, and means that they are thus a form of extremism. What we want to suggest through this analysis, and I'll turn to the case study pretty much now, is that by understanding how these fictions work, we can gain insights into other forms of communication that sit troublingly at the blurred line between dissent and extremism. So our case study focuses on the novellas of Mike Marr, or Mike Marney, a former Breitbart writer. The book's Harassment Architecture, which was released just a few days after the Christchurch massacre, and its sequel, Gothic Violence. So these are highly popular in the manosphere, prominent in eco-fascist and accelerationist circles, recommended on the America First reading list, and have been linked to inciting terrorist attacks, or attempts to incite terrorist attacks, such as on the Terror Wave Refined Telegram channel. So Harassment Architecture, the first novella, which is certainly the most widely read, tracks the narrator's descent from normie, dissatisfied with American society and culture, through increasing violence to outright espousal of militant accelerationist action and advocacy in the final few pages. Gothic Violence picks up where it leaves off, and gives an account of escalating accelerationist violence that ultimately leads to the succession of Florida and its, I guess, reconstitution, reformation as a nostalgic, vaguely pre-modern seeming libertarian and agrarian utopia, but that's ruled by white masculine violence in place of law. It is then an extremist political fiction in terms of the plot, what actually happens in the story. It's what's been elsewhere called a blueprint and fantasy, in the sense that the Turner Diaries, the Northwest Quintet, and so on are. This does not qualify it as vilificatory speech, however, according to the schema that we've outlined, because as a fiction, there is arguably scope for interpretation. The blurb on the Amazon site for the books say that they are satires, not fantasies or instruction manuals, for example. So we don't want to spend too much time on the details of the novellas. You can buy them or download them for free if you wish to. They don't make good reading. But so we don't want to spend too much time on the details themselves, but we want to give enough examples to show that they are in fact monologic, that they switch off the ambiguity of fiction in order to restrict possible interpretation, while also playing with literary features just enough to maintain an aestheticised facade, and thus a level of plausible deniability that they in fact incite violence, but that becomes extremely implausible when they're read in context. And thirdly, that they blur the distinction between fiction and reality, and thus include a practical political imperative outside of the fiction itself. Okay, so I'm not giving direct quotes here because nobody really needs to see PowerPoint slides full of slurs and descriptions of violence, but both books are monological, so the narrator's ideology never shifts. His hatred of contemporary American society and most people in it, especially minority groups, escalates in the degree of violence, but really nothing else. It is never challenged by other characters. There are extremely few of them. Both books, moreover, contain sections that sort of claim to report overheard conversations from everyday people that echo the narrator's dissatisfaction and sometimes also his calls for violence. Characters that disagree with his position by word, implication, or action. Thanks, sorry, I've got my reading glasses on. Are viciously dismissed and almost without exception, violently murdered. The books are also highly repetitive. His anger leads to violence over and over and over again. So it's not much of an exaggeration to say that nothing else happens. So the ambiguity of fiction and the need for interpretation is switched off in both books through extensive, repeated references to an absolute grab bag of far-right ideologies and positions over and above what sort of worked into the narrative. This includes statements supporting violent accelerationism and eco-fascist positions. There's very significant references to what Sir Vivian was talking about in terms of militant wellness. He really hates gluten. They invoke white I mean, I'm celiac, so do I, but differently. They invoke white nationalist and identitarian positions. They also heaps of references to conspiracy theories from stolen elections, the Great Replacement, child sacrifice, elite and media manipulation. These kinds of things are just woven into the narrative. screeds of often vitriolic and violent language against groups that are habitually targeted by the far right, so people of colour, trans people, women. They're highly misogynistic. Anti-vaccination stances, a violent anti-abortion fantasy. If you have any sort of knowledge of any kind of far-right discourse, these are unmistakably directly plugged into those, and you can see that develop in a couple of years from when harassment architecture was published to Gothic violence, that the references change with the points that are being picked up in the discourse. So what I'm getting at here is that there's no way to interpret these books except as incitement of violence or with deliberate and false naivety as satire, unless the reader is really disconnected from far-right discourse, and certainly, happily, some people are. A reader's comments on the review site, such as Goodreads, make this really clear. So they can be read obviously without making the reader act violently, but the intended meaning is clear, even to those that find it repugnant. And finally, there are clear pointers within the text themselves, as well as in the ways that they're talked about online, that they're pointing to a practical imperative. So at the end of harassment architecture, as you can see here, there are accelerationist posters that link to the Pine Tree Party. And this finally erases any ambiguity or space for interpretation. And these are from the printed version. There was a PDF version that was circulated a couple of months later after this was published, which doesn't have them quite as clearly, but the Telegram channels on which they were circulated kind of serve exactly the same purpose. They were very overtly white nationalist channels. So Mike Maher's novellas then are extremist in the terms that we've described. They incite violence through vilificatory speech that includes an imperative to act. So working from this argument and our case study then, I want to talk really briefly about the nature of dissent as opposed to extremism, not just in terms of fiction, but more broadly in terms of what happens in communication. So extrapolating out from what we said is extremist fiction, we can say that dissenting fiction is necessarily dialogic. So there's more than one perspective or voice is either represented or has some capacity to speak within a communicative space without being sort of viciously and violently dismissed. Communication is open to more than one interpretation. And there's no imperative to act, specifically in this case, to act in a way that leads to violence or that logically leads to violence. So if any one of these criteria is met, we'd suggest then communication is expressing dissent rather than extremism. We would add here that in regard to point 3, we don't see the call to act as being specifically a call for violence or for immediate violence necessarily, as being sort of essential to extremism. So the examples of the posters at the end of harassment architecture show this. None of them are saying, go out and commit murder right now. I've got like 2 more sentences. Point 2, the space for interpretation is the most complex in practical circumstances, we think, not least because many political actors are absolutely adept at employing literary devices to create at least an appearance of ambiguity. So, you know, the claim that these books are satire is one of those. So extremism and dissent, then we suggest, can be explored fruitfully through fiction, and critical questions emerge around voice, interpretation, and action, and calls to action in communicative spaces. I will stop there. Thanks.